Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The sound of a hand plane moving over aromatic cedar is a specific kind of music. It's a rhythmic, physical conversation between the steel and the grain. If you do it right, the wood curls away in translucent ribbons, thin as a secret and twice as honest. I've spent a lot of time in this garage since I retired. It's a place where things make sense. In the world of federal banking, you deal with abstractions, derivatives, synthetic collateralized debt obligations, things that don't exist in physical space. But here, if a joint doesn't fit, it's because your measurements were off. If the finish is dull, it's because you rushed the sanding. There is no room for a lie in carpentry. I was working on a small birdhouse with my granddaughter, Lily. She's 7, with a serious face and a habit of biting her lower lip when she's concentrating. We have a Saturday morning ritual. I make us both hot chocolate, from scratch, mind you, with the cocoa powder and the whisk, none of that instant syrup, and we spend 2 hours out here. She was currently focused on a piece of 80 grit sandpaper, her small hand moving in slow, deliberate circles over a scrap of pine. "Grandpa?" she asked, not looking up from her work. The sound of the sandpaper stopped. "Yes, Lily?" "Why does Daddy say you're getting forgetful? He told Mommy your brain is like an old attic with the lights turned off." I stopped the plane mid-stroke. I didn't look up immediately. I watched a single cedar curl flutter to the concrete floor. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence usually precedes a bank run or a market crash. I looked at my watch, an old Casio F91W with a cracked resin strap. I've worn it for 30 years. It's been through audits in 3 different time zones and survived 2 recessions. It keeps perfect time. "Does he say that?" I asked. My voice was level. When you spend 30 years as a senior federal bank examiner for the FDIC, you learn how to keep your pulse from showing in your speech. You learn that the moment you show emotion, the person across the table knows they've found your weakness. "He told Mommy that we need to help you manage the big houses. He said you forgot to pay the tax man last month and that the government might come and take them away if he doesn't step in." I set the plane down on its side, the way you're supposed to so you don't dull the blade. I hadn't forgotten to pay the tax man. My property taxes on the 4 apartment complexes Martha and I spent our lives building were paid 3 weeks early. I have the receipts, hard copies, stamped and dated, filed by category in the green metal cabinet behind me. I don't trust digital clouds. Clouds disappear when the wind changes. Paper remains. Just then, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the quiet. It wasn't the dull thud of a truck or the hum of a sedan. It was the sharp, aggressive crunch of a silver German SUV. It didn't belong here in my driveway. It looked like a polished tooth in a mouth of working man's gravel. Out stepped Brent, my son-in-law. Brent is the kind of man who wears a suit to a backyard barbecue just so everyone knows he's the most expensive thing in the yard. He smelled like a mixture of sandalwood cologne and the cold, metallic scent of high-interest debt. He walked into my garage like he was conducting a site inspection for a foreclosure. "Walter," he called out, his smile a fraction of a second too late to be genuine. "Hard at work, I see, teaching the youth the value of manual labor." He looked at the sawdust on his Italian leather loafers and winced. "Lily, honey, go inside and help your mom for a minute. Your grandpa and I need to have a serious talk about the future." Lily looked at me, her eyes wide. I gave her a small, reassuring nod, and she scurried off, leaving her sandpaper sitting on the workbench. Brent waited until she was out of earshot. Then he pulled a thick black leather folder from his briefcase. He didn't set it on the workbench. He held it like it was a holy relic. "Look, Walt," he started, his tone shifting into that oily, manufactured concern that people use when they're about to ask you for a kidney or your life savings. "We're all worried. Sarah is worried. After your heart procedure last year, the doctors said recovery for a man of your vintage can be unpredictable. The mental fog is a real thing, Walt. It starts small, forgetting a bill here, a name there. I haven't forgotten any names, Brent. I picked up a rag and started wiping down the blade of the plane. Of course you haven't, not yet, but that's the point of being proactive. He finally laid the folder on the workbench, right on top of the cedar dust Lily had just made. I'll tell you what I need, Brent. I leaned back. I need to back up a moment. I've spent my life looking at the fine print for the federal government. I don't sign anything without a pot of coffee at a quiet room. I'll look at these over the weekend. Time is of the essence, Walt, he pressed, his voice rising just a half step in pitch. The market is shifting. Interest rates are volatile. If we don't restructure the debt on the 4th Street complex by Friday, we're looking at a massive tax hit. I'm trying to save you from yourself here. I'll look at them, I repeated. My voice was a dead end. He stayed for another 10 minutes, pacing the small space, talking about leverage and liquidity and emerging markets. He sounded like a brochure for a Ponzi scheme. When he finally realized I wasn't going to pick up the pen, he packed up his folder with a sharp, frustrated snap of the magnets. In his haste, he didn't notice a single sheet of paper flutter out of the back of the folder and slide under my table saw. I waited until his silver SUV had roared back down the driveway, kicking up dust that settled on my flower beds. Then I walked over and picked up the paper. It wasn't a medical form. It wasn't even a power of attorney. It was a pro forma invoice from a company called Apex Development Group. It was a valuation of my 4 properties, but they weren't listed as family assets. They were listed as collateral for acquisition loan number 492B. I looked at the date on the invoice. It was from 3 weeks ago. Brent hadn't just been planning to help me. He had already started spending money he didn't have, using my life's work as the ask. I walked to the door of the garage and flipped the heavy iron bolt. I looked at the birdhouse. The roof was still missing. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. My hands weren't shaking, but I could feel that old familiar hum in the back of my brain, the one I used to get right before we walked into a bank to seize the keys and freeze the vaults. The first crack had appeared in the foundation, and in my experience, once a foundation starts to crack, it's only a matter of time before the whole structure comes down. I made a pot of coffee. I pulled out my black moleskin. I waited. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in what the young people call gaslighting. I prefer to call it a failed audit of my character. Brent didn't just want my signature, he wanted my sanity. He knew that as long as I was fit and proper, that's an old FDIC term for someone qualified to run a bank, he couldn't touch the deeds. So he set out to prove I was neither. It started small, subtle, the kind of things you'd dismiss as a senior moment if you weren't trained to spot patterns of fraud. On Tuesday, Brent stopped by just to check in. He walked into the kitchen where I was reading the paper. He didn't say hello. He went straight to the stove, stared at it for a long second, and then sighed, a heavy theatrical sound full of practiced disappointment. "Walt, again?" he said, shaking his head. "You left the front burner on. You could have leveled the block." I looked at the stove. The dial was at 0. The element was cold. I had been in the kitchen for an hour, and the only thing I'd touched was the electric kettle. "The stove isn't on, Brent," I said. I didn't get up. I didn't defend myself. I just watched him. "I just turned it off, Walt. That's the problem. You don't even remember doing it. This is exactly what Sarah and I are terrified of. You're becoming a hazard to yourself and the neighborhood." He didn't know I had a hidden camera in the kitchen, a small motion-activated unit I'd installed years ago when we had a string of package thefts in the area. I knew exactly what that camera saw. Brent reaching for the dial, turning it on for a split second, then turning it back and pretending to save me. I reached into my breast pocket and felt the edge of my black moleskin. Tuesday, 10:45 a.m. Subject staged a gas leak scenario. Narrative, incompetence. Evidence, digital backup saved. But he didn't stop there. He was slicker than a wet road. On Thursday, my daughter Sarah called me, her voice trembling. "Dad, Brent said you missed your appointment with the cardiologist. He said he waited at the clinic for 2 hours and you never showed up. Why didn't you call him?" "Sarah," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I don't have a cardiologist appointment until next month. It's written on the calendar in the pantry. It's been there for 6 weeks. Brent said the clinic called him because he's the emergency contact. He said they moved it up because of your labs." I went to the pantry. The calendar was gone. Not moved, not fallen behind the shelf. Gone. That sat wrong with me. In my profession, you learn that when documents start disappearing, someone is trying to rewrite history. I called the clinic directly after I hung up with Sarah. They confirmed what I already knew. No appointment had been scheduled and no one had called Brent. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that afternoon, the house quiet around me. I could feel the trap closing. It's a specific sensation, the way the air feels right before a federal seizure, that heavy, charged atmosphere where everyone is waiting for the first person to flinch. Brent started showing up with friends. That was the phrase he used. "Hey, Waltz, this is Marcus. He's a specialist in senior transitions. We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd see how you're holding up." Marcus was a man who wore a pinky ring and a smile that looked like it had been carved out of cheap plastic. He didn't look at me. He looked at the house. He looked at the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the original stained glass in the entryway. He wasn't a transition specialist. He was a liquidator. I'd seen his type a dozen times in the 90s, circling failing savings and loans like vultures over a dying calf. "Nice place you got here, Walter." His voice was a raspy baritone. "Lot of equity tied up in old wood. Seems a shame to let it just sit here. A man your age should be liquid, mobile, not anchored to a bunch of drafty hallways." "I like the drafts," I told him. "They keep me awake." Brent laughed, but it was a sharp, jagged sound. "He's a card, isn't he? Still thinks he's running an audit at the Treasury. But between you and me, Marcus, the ledger is getting a bit blurry." They talked about me as if I were a piece of furniture, a sideboard that had seen better days and was ready for the estate sale. I let them. I kept my powder dry. Every dismissive comment, every fake care package, every brochure for Golden Oaks memory care that accidentally ended up in my mail, it all went into the moleskin. I was waiting for the overreach. Every fraudster has a moment where they get impatient. They've done the groundwork, they've planted the seeds of doubt, and then they see something they want, a car, a house, a line of credit, and they move too fast. I found the brochures on Saturday morning. They were tucked inside my copy of the Wall Street Journal. Golden Oaks, a new chapter in dignity. The pages were dog-eared at the section regarding involuntary placement and asset management for the cognitively impaired. There was a sticky note in Brent's handwriting. "Sarah, I think we need to make the move before he hurts himself or someone else. I've already spoken to the intake director. We just need the POA signed to fund the deposit." He wasn't just trying to take the properties anymore. He was trying to take my floor, my walls, and my front door. He wanted me behind a keypad-locked door in a beige room so he could manage my life into his own pockets. I looked at the brochure, then I looked at the birdhouse on the workbench. It was still missing its roof. I thought about Lily. I wondered what he was telling her while he was busy trying to erase me. I didn't get angry. Anger is a luxury for people who aren't in a fight. I felt that cold, familiar clarity, the judge's monologue. I wasn't a father-in-law anymore. I was a senior examiner, and I had just found the smoking gun in the loan file. I walked down to the basement. I locked the door. I sat at my desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. "All right, Brent," I whispered to the empty room. "You want to talk about restructuring? Let's talk about it. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely." When the weight of Brent's shadow felt too heavy, or when the house started to feel like a cage he was building around me, I retreated to the sunroom. It was the last room we added to the house, and it was the only place where the air still felt like it belonged to her, Martha. I've only said her name once since she passed 3 years ago. I keep it tucked away, like a silver coin you don't want to tarnish with too much handling. She was the one who kept the books, not because I couldn't, but because she had a way of making the numbers dance. While I was out at the FDIC, auditing banks that have forgotten how to be honest, she was here, building our fortress brick by brick. I sat in her old wicker chair, the one with the faded floral cushion that still bore the slight indentation of her frame. On the small side table sat her garden ledger. It's a blue, cloth-bound book, the edges frayed and the spine softened by years of use. I picked it up, and the scent of it hit me, a faint, lingering ghost of dried lavender and old paper. She used to keep little muslin bags of lavender tucked into the drawers to keep the moths away. I opened the ledger to a random page, July 1994. "The hydrangeas are thirsty this year," she had written in that elegant slanted handwriting. "Walter says the new duplex on 4th Street is finally ours. We'll plant the lavender there next spring. It's a good house, Martha. It has good bones." I ran my thumb over the ink. I remember that day. We'd spent 6 months eating tuna out of cans and driving a truck that coughed every time we hit a hill, just so we could scrape together the down payment. We didn't buy those properties to be real estate moguls. We bought them because Martha wanted to know that if the world ever went sideways, if the banks I audited ever truly collapsed, we'd have a roof over our heads that no one could take away. She was the straight shooter in our marriage. She didn't care about the silver SUVs or the Italian loafers Brent was so fond of. She cared about the grain of the wood and the depth of the soil. "Walter," she'd told me once, while we were painting the shutters on our first rental, "wealth isn't what you spend, it's what you keep. It's the peace of mind you have when the sun goes down." Brent was trying to treat her peace of mind like a line of credit. I looked out the window at the garden. It was overgrown now. My knees aren't what they used to be, and without her there to point where the weeds were hiding, I'd let it slip. But the lavender was still there, struggling against the encroaching ivy. I thought about the night Sarah brought Brent home for the first time. He was slicker than a wet road even then. He talked about disrupting markets and leveraging assets. Martha caught my eye across the dinner table and gave me a look I knew well. It was the look she gave when she found a calculation in our personal ledger that didn't balance. "He's a spender, Walter," she'd whispered to me later that night. "He looks at the world and sees a thing to be used, not a thing to be tended." She was right, as always, and now he was looking at her legacy, at the 4 complexes we bled for, and he saw nothing but a way to pay off his own failures. He didn't see the families living in those units, some of whom had been there for 20 years. He didn't see the craftsmanship in the original crown molding. He just saw collateral for acquisition loan 492B. A man like Brent thinks that when a person dies, their things just become stuff. He doesn't understand that for a man like me, every brick in those buildings is a Saturday afternoon Martha and I spent together. Every lease agreement is a dream we had for Sarah and Lily. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, but it wasn't the kind that makes you want to sit down and cry. It was the kind that makes you want to stand up and lock the gate. It was the cold, hard realization that Brent wasn't just gaslighting me, he was insulting her. He was betting that I had forgotten the promise I made to her in this very room 3 days before she slipped away. "Keep the houses, Walter," she'd whispered. "Keep them for the girl. Make sure she has a place where the world can't touch her." The girl was Lily, and the place was the security we'd built. I closed the blue ledger. I felt the weight of it in my hands, solid and real. This wasn't about mental fog or senior transitions. This was about a breach of contract,
a breach of the most sacred contract I'd ever signed. I stood up. My joints creaked, but my mind was as clear as a bell in a frost. I looked at the Casio on my wrist. It was 3 p.m. I realized then that I had been playing his game. I'd been defending myself against his lies, trying to prove I wasn't crazy. That was my mistake. In an audit, you don't defend, you investigate. You don't wait for the thief to tell you where the money is. You follow the paper trail until he has nowhere left to run. I walked out of the sunroom, leaving the ghost of the lavender behind. I went down to the basement, to the room that smelled like old paper and ink. "I'm sorry, Martha," I murmured as I sat down at my desk. "I let him get too close. I'll fix it now." I hadn't touched my old professional encrypted laptop in months. It was a heavy, ruggedized thing, a relic from my days as a senior examiner. I plugged it in and watched the screen flicker to life. The hunt was officially on. I wasn't the old man anymore. I was a federal bank examiner with a target in my sights, and Brent had left a paper trail a mile wide. I know how this sounds. You think I should have been mourning, but I've always found that the best way to honor the dead is to protect what they loved. I opened the first file. I started with the property deeds. I wanted to see exactly how deep the rot went. I stayed in that basement until the sun went down and the house grew cold. I didn't turn on the heater. I wanted to feel the chill. It kept me sharp. By the time I finished the first pass, I knew one thing for certain. Brent hadn't just overplayed his hand. He had bet the entire house on a hand he didn't even hold. And I was about to call his bluff. I let the house grow dark. There's something about the way a basement feels at night, the way the silence presses against the concrete walls that makes the mind move more precisely. I didn't need the overhead lights. The blue glow from my ruggedized laptop was enough. This was my old cockpit, the place where I had dismantled the careers of crooked executives from Chicago to Miami. Brent thought I was past it. He thought my brain was a cluttered attic. He didn't realize that for 30 years my brain had been a high-speed processor for federal regulations.
I began the quiet audit with a single search of the public record. In my line of work, we have a saying, "The numbers don't lie, but the people who move them are often poets." I wanted to see the poetry Brent had been writing on my property deeds. I accessed the county clerk's portal. It was 11:30 p.m. I pulled up the title history for the 4th Street complex, the one Martha and I called the Anchor. There it was, a notice of grant deed transfer. My breath hitched in my chest, not because of the transfer itself, but because of the signature at the bottom. It was mine, or a very good imitation of it. It had the same slight hitch in the W and the sharp terminal stroke on the R. But to a man who spent a decade at the FDIC verifying loan documents, it was a forgery. It was too perfect. Real signatures have the variability of a human pulse. This was a digital overlay, likely pulled from a high-resolution scan of my last tax return. Brent hadn't just been asking for my signature, he'd already stolen it. I dug deeper. I moved from the public records into the private plumbing of Brent's financial life. I knew the bank he used, First Regional. They were a mid-tier outfit with aggressive growth targets and, as I suspected, a very lax compliance department. I used a backdoor query, the kind of professional courtesy contact I've maintained with old colleagues at the state regulatory board. I wasn't looking for his bank balance, I was looking for his LTV, loan-to-value ratio. By 1 a.m., the picture was clear, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Brent was drowning. His Apex Development Group was a shell, a classic special purpose vehicle, SPV, designed to hide debt. He'd taken out a massive bridge loan to buy a tract of unbuildable wetland in the valley, betting on a zoning change that never happened. He was on the hook for $3 million in personal guarantees, and the interest was compounding daily. He was using my $4 million portfolio as a cross-collateralization anchor. In technical terms, he was trying to restructure my debt-free properties into a repo, a repurchase agreement. He would sell the properties to his shell company for a fraction of their value, then borrow against them at the full market rate to pay off his bridge loan. He'd be flush with cash, and I'd be left holding the bag of a leveraged entity that he planned to bankrupt within 18 months. It was a bust-out scheme, plain and simple. I felt a cold, surgical detachment. I wasn't an angry father-in-law anymore. I was a senior examiner, and I just found the smoking gun in a failing bank's Tier 1 capital file. "I'll tell you what, Brent," I whispered to the screen. "You wanted to play in the big leagues. You wanted to move money like a New York hedge fund, but you forgot the first rule of the game. Never try to outcalculate the man who wrote the audit manual." I started making my own moves. I didn't reach for a lawyer yet. I reached for the FDIC administrative code. I drafted a title fraud alert and a beneficiary change freeze. I didn't send them through the mail. Brent would just intercept them. I used a secure portal to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC. Because my properties were being used as collateral for a loan from a federally insured bank, I could trigger a suspicious activity report, an SAR. In the world of federal banking, a SAR is like a silent alarm. The person being investigated doesn't know it's been filed. The bank doesn't even tell them. But suddenly, every transaction over $10,000 gets a second set of eyes. Every wire transfer gets delayed. Every credit line gets reviewed for compliance. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting off my glasses. I felt the familiar weight of my Casio on my wrist. 03:15 a.m. Brent was currently sleeping in his expensive bed, dreaming of the yachts he was going to buy with my equity. He didn't know that 3 floors beneath his feet, the old man had just tripped a wire that would eventually lead the federal government straight to his door. But then, I saw the final document in the digital folder. It was a wire transfer request for $200,000, scheduled for next Tuesday. The source of the funds? Account 8842, the Lily Bloom Fund. The air in the basement suddenly felt very thin. He was emptying his own daughter's college fund to pay the origination fees for the fraud against her grandfather. He was eating the seed corn to hide the fact that he'd already burned the barn. I closed the laptop. I didn't need to see any more. The quiet audit was over. The doubt was gone. The diagnosis was complete. Brent was a parasite, and he was currently feeding on the 2 people I loved most in this world. I didn't go to bed. I went to the garage. I picked up the hand plane. I didn't work on the birdhouse. I just ran the blade over a piece of scrap oak over and over until the pile of shavings reached my ankles. I needed the physical sensation of the steel cutting the wood. It reminded me that justice, like carpentry, requires a sharp edge and a steady hand. He thought he was the hunter. He thought I was the prey because I move a little slower and I like the smell of sawdust. He didn't know that in the world of financial crime, I'm the one who sets the season and issues the permits. And for Brent, the season was about to open. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Keep listening.
The sun was barely up on Sunday morning when I found her. Lily was sitting on the porch steps, her small shoulders hunched, her chin resting on her knees. She wasn't wearing her usual bright-eyed curiosity. She looked small. She looked like she was trying to disappear into her own oversized sweater. "Hey there, little bird," I said, my voice soft. I sat down on the step beside her, the old wood groaning under my weight. "I thought we were going to finish the roof on the birdhouse today. I've got the brass nails all polished and ready." She didn't look at me. She was staring at her sneakers, the ones Martha had bought her just a month before she passed. "Grandpa," she whispered, "is it true that I'm not going back to school next year? Daddy said I have to go to the public school because you're hemorrhaging money. He said your special doctors cost more than my classes." I felt a sharp, cold jab in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart procedure. My daughter Sarah had mentioned a savings plan Brent had set up for Lily's college and private schooling. I'd seeded that account with $50,000 the day she was born. Martha had been the one to name it the Lily Bloom Fund. It was meant to be untouched until her 18th birthday. Is that what he told you, Lily? He told Mommy that you were losing everything because your brain isn't working right. He said he had to use my school money to pay the tax man so they wouldn't put you on the street. That dog won't hunt. The fury that rose in me wasn't the hot, screaming kind. It was the kind of cold, crystalline anger that settles in the marrow of your bones. I realized then that Brent wasn't just a thief, he was a scavenger. He wasn't just stealing my past, he was devouring her future. He was using a 7-year-old's college fund as a bridge loan to cover the origination fees for his fraud against her grandfather. He had even contacted her school to tell them she wouldn't be returning. He was willing to strip his own daughter of her stability, her friends, and her education just to buy himself another month of pretending to be a high flyer. I looked at the small wooden birdhouse sitting on the workbench in the distance, its roof still missing, its interior exposed to the wind. It looked vulnerable. It looked exactly like Lily felt. Lily, I want you to listen to me. I turned so she had to look me in the eye. I have a very sharp pencil and a very long memory, and I promise you, by the time the sun goes down next Friday, you won't have to worry about the taxman or the school ever again. Do you trust me? She looked at me for a long beat, then nodded slowly. I trust you, Grandpa. Good. Now, why don't you go inside and get the hot chocolate started? I need to make one phone call, a professional call. I watched her go inside, her pace a little lighter than it had been 5 minutes ago. As soon as the door clicked shut, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old leather wallet. Tucked behind my driver's license was a business card I'd kept for 5 years. It was for a man named Arthur Vance, the senior manager at First National Bank. I'd saved Arthur's bank from a regulatory disaster back in 2014 when a junior loan officer had tried to hide a series of non-performing assets. Arthur was a straight shooter, the kind of man who remembers a favor for a lifetime. I dialed the number. Arthur, I said when he picked up. It's Walter. I need a favor. I need to schedule a final signing in your private conference room this Friday, and I need you to invite some very specific guests. I'm going to need a court reporter, a state police financial crimes investigator, and someone from the State Bar Ethics Committee. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. That's a heavy room, Walter. Who's the target? My son-in-law, I said. He's trying to restructure my life. I think it's time we showed him what a real audit looks like. I'll have the room ready, Arthur replied. And, Walter, I still have those files you saved for me. I owe you more than a conference room. I know, I said. I'm counting on it. I hung up. The motivation had shifted completely. This wasn't about the $4 million portfolio. It wasn't about the houses or the land or the bricks. It was about the girl in the kitchen whisking the cocoa. Brent had made the mistake of thinking I was a victim. He forgot that a shepherd is only quiet until the wolf touches a lamb. I walked back into the garage. I didn't pick up the plane. I picked up a heavy iron bar. I felt the weight of it, the coldness of the metal. The trap was no longer just a digital file on an encrypted laptop. It was a physical reality, and Brent was about to walk right into the center of it. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real. I spent the next 3 days being exactly the man Brent wanted me to be. I was the confused old man. I wore my sweater inside out once just to see him smirk. I told him I'd thought it over and that he was right. The numbers were getting too loud for me anymore. I just can't keep track of the decimals anymore. Brent, you take over. Just bring me the papers. I want to spend my time in the garden. He was so excited he could barely keep the slicker-than-a-wet-road grin off his face. He thought he'd finally broken my spirit. He didn't realize I was busy constructing a 4-layer trap that was invisible to the naked eye, but devastating to the balance sheet.
In the world of federal banking, we have a term called redlining a transaction. It's when you allow a fraudster to continue their move just so you can document the full extent of the criminality. I was redlining Brent. Layer 1. The modified digital signature. Brent sent me the final restructuring documents via email for a pre-read. I didn't just read them. I ran them through a steganography tool I'd kept from my days at the Treasury. I digitally signed the PDFs, but I embedded a hidden watermark in the metadata, a standard FDIC audit marker used to flag documents for Tier 1 capital review. The moment Brent's bank, First Regional, uploaded those documents to their portal, a silent, mandatory federal review would be triggered in their compliance department. They wouldn't know why the flag was there, only that the system wouldn't let the loan close without a manual override from a federal examiner. Layer 2, the suspicious activity report and the administrative hold. I called in a final favor from a former colleague at the state escrow office. I didn't ask her to stop Brent's $200,000 transfer from Lily's fund. In fact, I told her to let it move, but only as far as a restricted escrow account. I filed a suspicious activity report that characterized the transfer as potentially fraudulent coerced transfer of minors' assets. That $200,000 was now sitting in a digital cage. Brent could see it on his screen, but the moment he tried to use it to pay his Apex fees, the account would lock like a vault door. Layer 3, the lis pendens. This was the heavy hammer. I had my own attorney, a man who worked for Martha and me for 30 years and knew where every body was buried, file a lis pendens on every single property in the portfolio. In the legal world, a lis pendens is a notice of pending litigation regarding the title. It makes the title dirty. It's like putting a "do not buy" sticker on a piece of fruit. No bank on earth, not even Brent's shady friends at First Regional, would touch those properties as collateral once that notice hit the wire. His loan was now backed by nothing but his own empty promises. The closing strategy. I told Brent I wanted to sign the final physical hard copies at the bank. For old time's sake, I told him over the phone, my voice sounding shaky and thin. I like the smell of a bank, Brent. It makes me feel official. Let's do it at Arthur Vance's branch. He's an old friend. Brent agreed instantly. He thought it was the rambling request of an old man losing his grip, but he didn't realize that by choosing a physical bank branch, I was moving the crime scene into a federally regulated space. In a bank, my words carry the weight of an affidavit. In a bank, Arthur Vance has the authority to freeze assets on the spot. I spent Friday evening in the garage. I didn't work on the birdhouse roof yet. I just sat there, winding my old Casio. It was the night before the reckoning. I know how this sounds. You're wondering if I felt guilty for trapping my daughter's husband, but I want you to understand something. I wasn't just protecting my money. I was protecting the system. Brent believed that because he was younger and faster, the rules didn't apply to him. He believed that an old man's life work was just unclaimed equity waiting to be harvested. I looked at the black moleskin on the workbench. It was full. Every lie, every staged gas leak, every brochure for Golden Oaks was documented with a date, a time, and a witness. Tomorrow, Brent. I texted him at 9 p.m. 10 a.m., let's put this to bed. He replied almost instantly, "Great move, Walt. You're doing the right thing for Lily and Sarah. See you then." I didn't reply. I closed the folder, I made a final pot of coffee, I sat in the dark and waited for the sun to come up. He had 12 hours.
He did not know that. The air in the First National Bank branch was recycled and cold, smelling of ozone and floor wax. It was exactly 10 a.m. I was wearing my best wool suit, the one I used to wear for congressional testimony. I carried my old leather briefcase, the one with the brass latches that click with a sound like a judge hitting a bench. Brent was already in the private conference room. He'd brought Marcus, his partner, and a young woman in a sharp blazer who was introduced as a notary. Brent looked like he'd swallowed the sun. He was radiant with the kind of arrogance that only comes to a man who thinks he's just outsmarted a ghost.
"Walt, you're on time. A man of the old school," Brent said, standing up to offer a hand I didn't take. He didn't seem to notice. He gestured to the mountain of paperwork on the mahogany table. "I've got everything laid out. We just need your wet ink signature on the deed transfers and the corporate resolution for Apex. Once these are stamped, the Lily Bloom Fund gets reimbursed and your properties are shielded from the taxman forever." I sat down at the far end of the table. I didn't open my briefcase yet. I just looked at him. I looked at the way he adjusted his cufflinks, the way Marcus was tapping a rhythm on his phone, the way the notary was already uncapping her pen. "I'll tell you what, Brent," I said. My voice was low, hitting that specific frequency I used when I was delivering a cease and desist order. "Before we get to the ink, I'd like to introduce a few people I invited to witness this transaction." Brent's smile didn't vanish, but it stiffened. "Witnesses? Walt, we have a notary right here. This is a private family matter." "Not anymore," I said. I looked at the heavy oak door. It opened on cue. Arthur Vance walked in first, looking grim. Behind him came three people who changed the temperature of the room instantly. First, a man in a windbreaker with state police embroidered on the chest. Second, a woman with a rolling briefcase and a look of institutional boredom that only comes from years at the State Bar Ethics Committee. And third, a court reporter who began setting up her steno machine without saying a word. "What the hell is this?" Brent snapped, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the carpet. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Arthur didn't look at him. He looked at me. "The room is secure, Walter. The digital hold on the accounts is active." I finally opened my briefcase. I didn't pull out a pen. I pulled out a stack of exhibits, each labeled with a red sticker. "Sit down, Brent," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. He sat. Marcus, sensing the shift in the wind, began to slide his chair toward the door. The state police investigator put a hand on his shoulder. "Stay put, Mr. Rossi. We're just getting started." I slid the first exhibit across the table. Exhibit A, the forensic document analysis. "You thought I didn't notice the mental fog narrative you were building, Brent. But while you were busy turning on my stove and hiding my calendar, I was having my personal records audited. This is a report from a former colleague at the FBI's document lab. It confirms that the signature on the preliminary grant deed you filed last Tuesday is a digital forgery, a pixel-perfect overlay of my 2022 tax return." Brent's face went from tan to a sickly mottled gray. That's a lie. You signed that in the garage. You were confused. I was in the garage, but I wasn't signing deeds. I was recording you. Exhibit B is the transcript of the audio from my garage, where you explicitly mentioned to Marcus, who is currently being investigated for 3 counts of securities fraud in Nevada, by the way, that the old man is a vault with a rusty lock, and that you'd already bridged the equity before I even saw the papers. The notary looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. She realized then that her seal had been used to witness a felony. "And here is the part that really sat wrong with me, Brent," I said. My voice dropped even lower. The room was so quiet I could hear the court reporter's fingers dancing on the keys. "Exhibit C, the Lily Bloom Fund. You didn't just target me, you targeted a 7-year-old girl. You moved $200,000 of her school money into a restricted escrow to pay the kickback fees to Marcus's shell company." "I was going to pay it back," Brent shouted, his voice cracking. "The Apex deal is a gold mine. I just needed the liquidity to close." "The Apex deal," I said, sliding Exhibit D forward, "is a wetland in a protected flood zone. It will never be built on. I know this because I spent 20 minutes on the phone with the EPA regional director yesterday. You didn't buy an investment, you bought a swamp, and you tried to use my life's work to pay for the mud." I looked at the woman from the ethics committee. "And since you involved a member of the state bar to draft these fraudulent deeds, I believe your legal team is currently facing a disbarment hearing as we speak." Brent looked around the room. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the investigator. He looked at the door. He was looking for a way out, but I had built the walls too high and the floor too slick. "You took me for a mug," I said. I felt the weight of my Casio on my wrist. It was 10:15 a.m. "You thought I moved a little slower, and I liked to work with my hands. My brain had turned to sawdust. But you forgot one thing about a bank examiner. We don't care about the personality. We don't care about the suit. We only care about the chain of title." I stood up. I didn't feel old. I felt like the man I was when I broke the back of the Highland trust fraud in '08. "Arthur," I said, "I believe the bank has sufficient evidence to trigger the administrative hold on all Apex-related accounts." "Already done, Walter," Arthur said. "The funds from the Lily Bloom Fund have been reversed and are back in the trust as of 3 minutes ago. As for the rest, the accounts have frozen pending federal indictment." The state police investigator stepped forward. He didn't use any flair. He just pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The sound of them clicking open was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in 3 years. "Brent Miller," the investigator said, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial exploitation. You have the right to remain silent." Brent didn't stay silent. He started crying. Not the kind of crying a man does when he's sorry for what he did, but the kind he does when he realizes he's finally been caught. He looked at me, his eyes red and desperate. "Walt, please, think of Sarah. Think of Lily." "I am thinking of them," I said. "That's why you're leaving." I watched them lead him out. I watched Marcus get read his rights. I watched the notary surrender her logbook. The room was suddenly very empty, just me, Arthur, and the smell of ozone. "You okay, Walter?" Arthur asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. "I'm fine, Arthur," I said. I started packing my exhibits back into my briefcase. I made sure the latches clicked. I walked out of the bank. The sun was hitting the pavement, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt like a foundation that had finally been leveled. I had one more thing to do. I had a roof to finish. 6 months is a long time in the world of finance, but in a garden, it's just one breath. The sentencing came down last Tuesday. Brent didn't get the country club prison he was expecting. The judge was a woman who had spent a decade in probate court before moving up the bench. She had a particular distaste for men who preyed on their own blood. Between the wire fraud and the identity theft, he's looking at 7 years. Marcus, his partner, took a plea deal and turned state evidence, but it didn't save him. They're sharing a wing in a federal facility 3 counties over. Sarah is quiet. She's staying in the guest room for now. It took a few months for the fog to lift, for her to realize that the man she married was a ghost she'd never really known. We don't talk about him much. Instead, we talk about the properties. I'm teaching her how to read a ledger, the real way, the Martha way. She's got a good head for it once you strip away the distractions. Lily's back in her school. The Lily Bloom Fund is now under a court-ordered guardianship, with Arthur Vance as the third-party executor. Not even I can touch it without a mountain of paperwork, and that's exactly how I want it. I want her to grow up knowing that her foundation is made of stone, not sand. It's Saturday morning again. The air in the garage is cool, carrying that crisp, biting scent of late autumn. I'm sitting at the workbench, my old Casio F91W ticking away on my wrist. I look at it. 10 a.m. Lily is standing next to me,
her tongue poked out in that familiar expression of total concentration. We're finally mounting the roof on the birdhouse. I let her drive the last brass nail. I held the wood steady while she tapped the hammer, her movements careful and deliberate. "Grandpa," she says, looking up as she wipes a smudge of blue paint from her forehead, "is it finished now?" I run my hand over the cedar. The roof is slanted just right to shed the rain. The joints are tight. The brass nails are flush. It's solid. It's honest. "It's finished, Lily," I say. "It'll stand up to any storm the valley can throw at it." I walk her to the door and watch her run toward the house, the birdhouse clutched in her arms like a prize. I stay in the garage for a moment longer. I pick up the hand plane and start to clean it, wiping the blade with an oiled rag. I look at the pile of cedar shavings on the floor. People think that getting old means you stop being useful. They think because you move slow, you've forgotten how to move at all. But I'll tell you what, the world is full of people like Brent, people who think they can outrun the truth because they have a faster car and a louder voice. They're wrong. The truth doesn't need to run. It just needs to sit still and wait for the audit to begin. I reach over and flip the switch on the wall. The lights in the garage flicker and go out, leaving the room in a soft gray twilight. I step out onto the gravel and pull the heavy door shut. I hear the bolt click into place, a sound of finality, of security, of peace. I walk toward the sunroom where the lavender is finally starting to reclaim the fence. I don't look back. There's no need to. You just have to keep your eye on the grain.